I'm Megan. Just for a little bit of background, I went to the University of Dayton, and I actually graduated with a degree in graphic design, and worked in graphic design for 10 plus years up until last year, which was kind of my year of change. I thought was the year of craziness, and thought being the key word there. So in May of last year, I quit my job and went to Tech Elevator for 3 months. And after graduating, was hired as an apprentice at Engage, and was put into a contract role at GE Aviation. So I started at GE at the end of August, and then 2020 rolled around, which ended up being the real year of change in my life and everyone's life. So at the beginning of the year, I was just kind of settling into my new job, learning about airplane engines and software and all that kind of stuff. And then obviously, as for everyone, coronavirus kind of took over all of our lives. And before I knew it, I was back on the bench at Engage. GE let a bunch of contractors go. So I was still luckily employed by Engage, but without a role. So I started looking for a new job, and started at Pure Romance at the beginning of May. So I'm gonna kind of go through some things that I learned, both interviewing and then starting at a new job, and doing all of this from my kitchen table in my house. And so I have yet to be in a room with any of my coworkers, which is an interesting experience, but we'll get to that. So my first one is being persistent in this age of everyone being stuck at home. I think one of the biggest things about this was, for instance, in my job search, I actually reached out to a recruiter and stopped hearing from her. And then another recruiter from the same company reached out to me, and I found out that the first recruiter had actually been laid off, and I didn't know that. And I was still emailing her and just not getting responses. So, and the second person from that company is actually the one who ended up finding my job for me. So just continuing being persistent and keep reaching out to those people who can help you in your job search. Next up is just having confidence. And I know there's a lot of research that women are very hesitant to apply for jobs that they don't think they're qualified for. So this isn't necessarily a in the time of coronavirus tip, but the job I actually have now, when the recruiter originally presented it to me, I was kind of hesitant that I didn't think I maybe was qualified for it, but it was just like, you know, whatever. Submit me anyway. And it ended up being that, like, my background in graphic design and a previous role I'd had at a different company, that company operates in very much the way Pure Romance does. So that ended up working to my advantage, and I am in the job that I am in now. Another tip I think is super important. I think we're all probably pretty practiced in Zoom by now, but definitely do some practice if you're not super comfortable, or if you're using a different platform for your interview. I also did a lot of, I volunteered with Tech Elevator to mock interview students who were going through Tech Elevator at the time. And I think that helped me, listening to their answers, kind of hear better ways to give answers in interviews, or things that I thought they did well, or just helped me reflect on my answers. So yeah, practice. Again, not super Zoom related, but everyone should do that. Interviewing is a skill. So I've also, at my new job, had the opportunity to interview people. And I think your Zoom setup is pretty important because it can be pretty distracting. So when I first started working from home, I was sitting like this dude right in front of a window. So I would get on Zoom calls sometimes, and people would be like, "Are you in the witness protection program? What's going on?" Like, so just kind of orienting yourself with a background that's not super distracting, but also not getting too comfortable. I've done an interview at my current role with someone who is like snuggled up on their couch with their dog in their lap, and like that's kind of distracting. So just setting yourself up for success. Like, this is obviously a professional situation. So really keeping that in mind, and standing up or sitting down in a regular chair. And then I think for me, I learned working from home. I didn't previously work from home before coronavirus, but especially the day of my interview, getting up, taking a shower, getting dressed in clothes that I would wear, pretending I was actually going on a job interview, leaving my house and going somewhere instead of sitting at my dining room table, and talking to someone through my computer. I think that really helped get me in the right mindset for that situation. And then another thing, just before you turn that Zoom camera on, just, giving yourself some confidence, getting in that power pose for a second, reinforcing that you can do this and you are qualified and they should hire you. And then again, I guess not super Zoom related, but just being your own advocate, I think that's also super important when you're interviewing through Zoom, because so much of what's happening, it's a lot harder to convey who you are and pick up body language and all that kind of stuff. So I was rewriting my elevator pitch before my interview, and contemplated leaving out a little tidbit about how at GE people didn't know that I had been through a boot camp very recently, and when they would find out, they would be surprised that I hadn't worked in tech a lot longer than that. And I thought about taking that out. I ended up leaving it in, and through like watching people on Zoom, I said that and they nodded, and you could see that resonated with them. So just, I think, remembering that you are your own advocate in these interviews, especially when it's through a computer and it's a lot harder to convey things, just speaking up and saying what you mean. And then I think the biggest perk of doing Zoom interviews is the fact that you can use a cheat sheet, and it's pretty easy to hide. So the recruiter I worked with had given me a bunch of information about Pure Romance and kind of how they worked. I had that. I had a whole list of a long list of questions to ask. So I was prepared with lots of questions for any time they gave me for that. And then any research you've done about the company, obviously, or the people you'll be interviewing with, is just handy to have. And again, they don't necessarily have to know that you have it all there. So just a really nice little perk. And then once you get the job, obviously, like I said, I started at Pure Romance in May. I have never been in a room with any of my coworkers, and we are not going back till next year. So I will not be for the foreseeable future. And I think most companies don't have great onboarding when you're in person. And I can tell you from experience, it's even worse when you're doing it from home. So I think the biggest thing, which it's not first in my nature to ask questions and ask for help, but that's something I've definitely had to learn over the past 2 or 3 months. And being willing to speak up for myself, and when I don't know something, to ask someone to help me and figure it out is really, really important. And then the last thing, which is also weird and a little bit hard, but again, I don't know any of my coworkers, so we've had a few, so I guess just participate. So we've had a few IT virtual happy hours with our company, and the first 1 or 2 were kind of awkward because I obviously didn't know very many people on the call, but just going and showing up and turning your camera on and participating as much as possible so you can meet people and get to know people. And so people know who you are when you're there. Because I don't talk to a lot of people outside of my small team. So I've gotten to meet more people that way. So yeah, so just remember that Zoom interviewing isn't that different than regular interviewing, but remember to be confident and do the best you can, I guess. So yeah, that is the end. Those were my
question time.
Thank you so much.
Unmute yourselves and ask any questions you have for Megan.
I have a question. So if you could change one thing about the current hiring process for developers, what would you change?
So it wasn't so much for me, but we have hired a backend developer since I started, and we asked a lot of super technical, definition questions. And a lot of my coworkers have gotten very hung up on whether or not people could answer those questions. And they just seem to focus so much on that. And that was not all of not so much on the rest of the interview. I wish it was less of that, I guess.
Yeah, I've been there. I know how that is. Anyone else?
Do you have any tips on better ways to onboard employees during this, or takeaways?
Well, I literally had zero onboarding. I went to the warehouse, I picked up my laptop. So I was there for an hour. I signed some papers, picked up my laptop and came home, and then was like, here's the repos. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I think really, just like I said, is it's not my nature to ask a lot of questions. And I've just had to force myself to get on Slack and ask people questions and not feel like I'm going to look stupid. I think that's always my biggest thing, is I feel like I'm going to look stupid, but just ask the questions.
Let's see. I have another question. So how were your technical interviews? Was Pure Romance, I'm assuming you applied for other jobs beside Pure Romance.
I did, but this is very fluky that I got this job. This was actually the only interview I had.
Okay. So how did that technical interview go? Were they just asking you definition questions, or were you required to do a project?
So there was no project, but it was very hit or miss. It was just very like the technical questions they asked, because I'm actually in a front end role. So it was very like, they would ask like one question about one thing and then one question about something completely different. I think they were just trying to figure out what I knew. Like, do you know anything about SEO? Can you put an H2 before an H1? So like some were like super detailed and others were very high level. And I think really they were just trying to figure out, what of all of front end development do you know?
Okay. That's good.
All right.
But I will.
If you had to stay remote forever, would you be okay with that? Or do you have a preference of like, if they give you that option in the future and said, hey, remote worked out, do you want to stay remote?
I definitely like working from home. I like being able to roll out of bed and just kind of walk up to my computer when I want to. But I definitely think it's a lot harder to work together. Like, I think productivity wise, I'm probably as productive or more than if I was at an office, but it's a lot harder for that collaborative process to work. So I think some kind of happy medium, whether that's like 1 or 2 days a week in the office, or when you're working on a project and not like heads down.
Yeah, a mix would be good.
I have a question, actually. So I am a current boot camp student, tech elevator student. What's up, Katie? So a lot of like the interview tips and stuff that I hear is like, just relax, be yourself, etc., etc. So how do you relax and be yourself when you're so nervous? It's like your first job out of boot camp and you're really excited. Do you have any does anybody like have any tips for how to not freak out?
I think,
Breathe.
go ahead.
Breathe. Remember to breathe. If you can do that, the rest will follow.
Study beforehand and make sure you get enough sleep, make sure you're getting enough water and food, but make sure you practice beforehand so you give that confidence. Don't try to wing it so much, but also know that they could ask you literally anything. So just try to focus on the basics. That's what I would do.
Yeah, and be okay with saying that you don't know something instead of trying to explain something that you don't know. I think that just being able to say, you know what, I don't know the answer to that question is actually pretty powerful and shows a lot of honesty and confidence.
And I would say, I know you will get this experience being at boot camp, but after you leave, like I said before, when I went back and mock interviewed people, I think I got a lot out of just listening. Like, a lot of people aren't great at answering, and you realize that as when you mock interview people, there were people I'm like, wow, that's a really good answer. And then other people I'm like, oh yeah, that's like kind of the answer I would have given. So I think that was just a really good experience.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll move on to our next talk. And I'd like to introduce Lorien Rensing, who will be talking about continuous integration, CI/CD. I made these slides, so I have to show them. So you can share your screen now.
Okay, is this sharing with the purple bar at the bottom?
Yep.
Okay, so this is odd because I'm not actually looking at my slides. I've got the speaker notes in front of me under the camera. So I'm Lorien. I am a software developer at a company called Making Everlasting Memories, which you have probably not heard of. If you have, my condolences, because we provide software for the funeral industry. And it's a really interesting job, and I've been there about 8 years now, and things have changed a lot since I've been there. And one of those big things has been how we've gotten our code from what we work on our local machines up into our production environment. So this is actually an excerpt from a longer talk that I'm preparing for Pittsburgh Tech Fest, which was scheduled to be last month. Right now it's scheduled to be virtually held next month, but we'll see how that goes. So continuous integration, continuous deployment, CI/CD, it's almost a buzzword in that everybody talks about it and they're very excited about it, but not everybody can necessarily explain what it is or why it's important, or what does that really mean? And what exactly does the D stand for? Is it delivery? Is it deployment? And how does that relate to continuous integration? So this talk is just going to sort of, on a high level, cover what all these things are and how they relate to each other. So we'll start with some quick definitions. So the first one, because it's at the beginning of our acronym, is continuous integration. So with that, it's when you can quickly merge the code you've been working on back into your main code base. So this is traditionally called, say, the master branch or the trunk. But it's when you do that, it's making sure all the code continues to work. So that's the key part of continuous integration, is it all has to work when it's merged together. Then our first CD, which is continuous delivery. And that would be when you take all of that code and it builds and all of its tests pass, and it can be deployed to your production server at any time that you choose. And finally, we have continuous deployment, which is our other D. And once again, your code builds, all your tests pass, but now it gets automatically deployed to your production server. So in a little more detail, we'll start with continuous integration, because without the continuous integration, you really can't have either of the other steps. So to deploy code, whether it's manual or automatic, you have to have code that works. So we start with the repository, which is our source of truth for all the code. And the big ones that are out there that people use are GitHub and Bitbucket. Some people will do their own. I think Microsoft's Team Foundation server is still out there, but Microsoft bought GitHub. The joke I heard was that it was cheaper to buy the company than to keep paying for all their private repositories on it. I don't know if that's true or not, but it makes a good joke. And it also sort of illustrates how much of a presence GitHub is in the market these days as a code repository. So you have a repository, and that means you can then move on to checking out the code to your local computer. And on your local computer, you do the development. You write code, you test it on your machine, and as part of that, one of the big things that really makes this CI/CD process work is having tests you can run automatically. So one of these would be unit tests that usually they get written by the developer themselves to test a discrete function, maybe a calculated property. And they're generally part of your project, written in the same language as your code. But you can also have some front-end tests. Our developers are using tools like Selenium and Nightwatch that actually can run on a headless browser. that they automate to make sure that things work together. You've also got integration tests that can make sure that, say, your code really can talk to your database. You don't have a typo in a connection string somewhere. So you finish your code, it works on your local machine. So you go ahead and you open your pull request to get your code back into the server. But you don't just open a pull request and merge it. With continuous integration, you actually have a build server in between. And what this is, it's just another computer. Ours is up in the cloud. And it will automatically build your code just as if you were running it on your own computer. The other thing it'll do is it'll run the unit tests. So it can run through all of the unit tests that are in your project. It can run through your Nightwatch or your Selenium tests. And it'll report back if it passed or if it failed. Did the code actually compile? Did all the tests pass? If you have a linter of some sort for any of your JavaScript, does everything follow the rules in the linter? So there's a couple popular ones. Jenkins is one of the big ones out there. TeamCity is another one. So once your code is building, once all your tests are passing, then you can merge your code back into this original repository, and we're back at the beginning of the circle. So the other thing you can do by putting it on one of these repositories is you can set conditions for the merge. So one of our conditions at my company is that all these builds pass on the build server and all the tests pass. Another one we've got is that you have to have your code reviewed by a different developer. You can't review your own code. The other restriction we've got is you can't merge directly into our main branch of code. Any new code that goes in there has to go in through a pull request. So you don't have people accidentally overwriting working code with code that may or may not work. So that's continuous integration, more or less in a nutshell. And that's our first step before we move on to continuous delivery. So we have our continuous integration process where people are constantly checking out code, opening pull requests, making sure everything builds, all of our tests pass, merging it back in, and repeating. Now this looks like it's the same step, but it's not. After that code gets merged back in, we have the final build that creates whatever artifacts that we might need for deployment. This is not does it build, this is, okay, let's actually build this and have our deployable code, whatever that means for the programming language you're working in. So now you have these artifacts out there and you're ready to deploy them to your web server. So you're now in control of when you want to deploy this code and where you want to deploy it. If you need to make any special arrangements for testing or for other resources to become available, or you need to coordinate with an outside group so that everybody's code is going live at the same time, or you have to go after someone or before someone, you can schedule that time. So that's continuous delivery. You're ready to deliver your code at any time. So you're in control of when things get released to production, but there's more manual work involved with scheduling. And usually this is done because there's a certain amount of manual testing, or otherwise a lot of times referred to as smoke testing, when the code goes live in production. And from there, we can move on to the next step, which is continuous deployment. So again, we have to start with continuous integration to make sure you've always got a code base that builds and is ready to be deployed. And again, we have to go to the build server. With continuous delivery, you could kick off this build for production manually, or you could automate it. With continuous deployment, you want to have this building automatically all the time. Because the next step is that after that code has built, to automatically deploy it to your web server. So this allows your code to get released very fast. Every time you make a change, your change can go live. once you've got things set up, there's pretty much no manual work involved in this. But unless you've got a really robust testing suite, you can have bugs slip through into production. The place you'll see this most often in the real world is every now and then word will get out that Facebook has released something that's definitely a bug. The one I'm remembering is they were releasing some sort of rating system, and it was something like, is this content valuable? Yes, no, button 3, button 4, which should not have gone out in that state, but it got merged in. Now, if you're big enough as Facebook, you can set your automatic deployments to go to only one web server in a farm at a time. And if you're releasing code that quickly, you can have another release an hour later or less that fixes that. If you're smaller, you may not have that option. And you can also do things that are a mix of continuous delivery and continuous deployment. So at my company, in addition to our production web servers, we've also got some testing servers. So our production web servers, we use continuous delivery. We schedule releases usually twice a week. Occasionally, we may do something only once a week if there's a holiday, for instance, or a lot of people are on vacation. If we have to do an emergency patch, we might add a third release in a week. But for our internal development server, we actually use continuous deployment. So every time a pull request gets merged back in, it builds and then it pushes so that we can immediately go and see what these code changes look like in, if not necessarily a production environment, at least a non-local environment. So that's where you catch things like, oh, I should have included this asset in the project, or I should have referenced something out on a file out on S3 and not on my local hard drive, because all of a sudden that asset won't be there when you're on a real server and not your own computer. So that lets us have a good mix of, we're able to test our changes fairly quickly because they're being continuously deployed to a test environment, but we still have that stability of knowing we're release new changes to production until after they've actually been looked at by at least one real person, rather than just hoping that all of our automated tests have caught everything. So that's just sort of your high-level overview, if anybody has any questions at this point.
Oh, I have tons of questions. This is like a hot button for me right now.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about changing processes on my team. So do you actually deploy automatically to prod? Like, just speaking where you're at right now?
No, not to production. Only to our, we've actually got 3 levels of server environments. So we only deploy automatically to the lowest one, which is the dev environment. QA looks at some stuff there. It's mostly developers double checking their own code, and QA may be doing some preliminary work. And then we do manual pushes to our test and production environments.
Okay.
We've automated a lot of it, but you still have to have an actual person push the button to make it all go through.
It terrifies me to think of it like fully automated personally, because
yeah, I understand.
Like, I don't know, does anybody ever get there? I'm kind of curious, yet at the same time.
Facebook does. Facebook also doesn't do QA.
Right, because they don't care. Yeah, like, you know.
Yeah, they have really committed to the fail fast thing,
yes.
And sometimes they fail publicly. But when your server farm is 100 servers, you can afford to have some bad code on 2 of them because you can pull them out of the mix real quick.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you're releasing code to production every 20 minutes, then it doesn't, in theory, take that much to get a patch pushed up.
Yeah.
On the other hand, when you have 2 web servers, you don't really have that option.
Yeah. So would you say part of the key to getting this whole process to work correctly is scoping your work properly, like making it small enough that you can, it's actually valuable, but at the same time you can get it done quick enough so that you're constantly constantly being.
Those would be two big things.
Yeah.
The third thing that I didn't really cover in this, but that is part of my larger presentation, is you also have to have a way to hide code that's not yet ready for production. So
That's my next question.
Yes. So we've actually rolled our own system of toggles where it's basically we've got a table in our database for each bit of code that we're working on, and then we've got a little front end page that we rolled ourselves, so you can switch this on or off, and anything that's related to that project that can't be shown yet gets wrapped in an if block. And it's basically, if the toggle is on, use the new code. If the toggle is off, use the old code.
Yeah.
So
yeah, we're talking about that sort of stuff too. That's
yeah, and really, this will not work without some way of hiding that code.
Yeah.
I'm running into the same problem. So I have an internal application where we do continuous deployment, and it's not so important because it's internal, but
Right.
part of the problem is our library, we have created a couple NPM packages that need to be published, but with automatic deployment, it has already tried to deploy it from, even though we haven't run the NPM package yet. So that might be helpful, is having some kind of toggle.
Yeah. Yeah. There was some friction when we started using them, but once we really committed to it and people saw how valuable it was, that you could have, say, a long-running project be continually worked on, and you could turn it on first the dev server and test it there, and then leave it off on the test server and the production server. And then you could move to turning it on the test server and off on the production, still having it off on the production server, or going back and forth to make sure that you're checking your toggles correctly. Because that's one thing we have not really figured out a way to do, is if you want to test both states, you have to test it with the toggle turned on and with the toggle turned off.
Yeah. All right, one more quick question. You talked about unit test. Do you, where you work, do you have like a standard as far as like test coverage percentage that you aim for?
We do not, mostly because if you're looking at just raw lines of code, if you've got a class that's just a model of something where you have a whole long list of properties and you're going for 100% test coverage, then you're writing tests that have no value. Does the getter work? Does the setter work? Okay, if these things fail, we have a bigger problem. So what we're looking for is mostly test coverage on anything that's got any sort of branching logic, if statements, switch case statements, things like that, and trying to get those covered.
Okay, I lied. One more question. You mentioned headless browsers. Could you just describe that real quick in case we have people on who aren't aware of what that term actually means?
In this case, it would be something that has more or less the engine you would have to run your web browser, whether that's Chrome or Firefox, or we actually still have to support Internet Explorer for a lot of our internal clients. And what it will do is it will run a web page without actually displaying it on your screen.
Do you have any preferences between the different build servers? I know you mentioned TeamCity and
Jenkins. Yeah, Jenkins seems to be the one that has more wide use. TeamCity is what we are using at my office. So they're both out there. They've both got a lot of devotees. When I was looking at them, they're both advertising the big companies that use them for their systems, and they're both got some really big names signed up with them. So I have not used Jenkins enough, and I am not a DevOps person.
Yeah.
So I don't really know how hard it is to configure one versus the other. But they do serve more or less the same function in a CI/CD system.
I don't know if I should say this out loud, but I will anyway. I used Jenkins at one job, and we fondly refer to it as Junkins.
We recently started using Bitrise, which is a mobile-first build server, and I have been quite pleased with it compared to some of the other build servers I have worked with. It has a very nice UI, easy to put stuff into it. Does anyone else have any questions before we move on? All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
You may have to unshare for me. Thank you.
Okay, so our last presentation of the night, our last lightning talk is by Alexx Mitchell, software engineer at Procter & Gamble, talking about Kotlin. So Alexx, are you ready to start sharing?
Okay, yeah, let me get set up. Okay, let's go ahead and share it. There we go. All right, can you all see my screen? Hello?
Yep,
Yeah.
we're good.
Okay, cool. Okay, so like Sierra said, my name is Alexx Mitchell, and tonight I'll be presenting on similarities and differences that I've learned or seen through learning Kotlin after JavaScript. So it's called Growing with Kotlin. So let's get started. So first off, let's start with an introduction. I'm Alexx. I'm a software engineer at Procter & Gamble. I work on e-commerce direct to consumer websites. I work on the front end, so I've been a front end developer for almost 2 years now. I am a coding bootcamp grad. So in my coding bootcamp, I learned full stack web development using JavaScript. So I don't have the traditional Java background in coming into learning Kotlin. Aside from that, I am a plant parent. In the back of my picture, you can see 2 of my children, Sid and Vern. So with that, let's get started. So our agenda for today, it'll be pretty quick. We're going to look at what is Kotlin and then look at some differences within Kotlin and JavaScript, and then move into some of the similarities that I've seen. So what is Kotlin? By definition, Kotlin is a cross-platform, statically typed, general-purpose programming language with type inference. So Kotlin can be used across multiple platforms, iOS, Android, web. It's statically typed, meaning that you have, for each variable, you have to let it know what type that's being sent through, unless that type can be inferred. As well, Kotlin is the official language for Android. So moving into some of the differences, over the next few slides, you'll see differences in syntax, as well as another difference is the way that errors are presented. So within Kotlin, errors are shown at compile time. So even when you're in your IDE, it'll show you what errors may cause a crash of your app. And JavaScript is different. It won't tell you about an error until runtime. Another difference is type coercion. In Kotlin, there isn't the issue of type coercion because you have to explicitly tell your application that you want to change types, whereas within JavaScript, you may use an operator that converts it and you don't know what else. Also inheritance. Within Kotlin, you're able to inherit from multiple classes, while in JavaScript, you're only able to inherit from one associated prototype. But aside from the differences, there are also some similarities that we'll see over the next few slides. So first, starting out with declaring variables and types. So within JavaScript, we're going to look at just 2 ways to declare variables. So const is a way to declare a constant variable, something that will not change. So in this example, I'm creating a custom object called myPlant and assigning values to the properties within it. Below it, we are creating a variable that can be reassigned called plant placement. So at first it starts out as windowsill, and then if I want to move my plant herself, I can say its plant placement is in table. But within Kotlin, you'll see that we can't automatically create a custom object. We have to first create a class. So within this class, we are assigning a variable to plant name. So this will be a constant. So a constant variable that won't change. So we use the use of val. As well, you can see at the end of it, we are letting you know what type it is of string. You're also able to declare default values. So the plant age lets you know that it'll be of type integer, and we're sending in a default value of 0. Oh, I skipped var. Var is similar to let. This just lets you know that this value can be reassigned. What else? Oh, the Boolean. Boolean with the question mark at the end of it lets you know that it is of a nullable type, so that that value at some point may be null, but at any other point in time, you can change the value. We're also giving it a default value just to make it more apparent. So yeah, and again, below plant placement, similar to the let as within JavaScript with var. Okay, so next we're going to move on to null safety. So within JavaScript, you have different ways of checking if a property is null or a variable is null. So instead of doing like instead of going out and saying like, hey, is this value null, but is this value equal to null, we're going to use optional chaining in this example. So we have our constant, declaring our constant, flowering, and using the question mark period is a way to see if a property exists on an object. This is fairly new to JavaScript, and it doesn't have wide support yet. But this is a way for you not to receive an error. You would receive undefined if that property doesn't actually exist on the object. Okay, so looking at Kotlin, and for flowering, in the last slide, we defined it as a Boolean of type nullable. So, and we also gave it a default value. So right here for myPlant.flowering, it will return a value of null. And in the example below it, if you were to use the question mark period with the let, so let is a special lambda that is equivalent to a null check within Kotlin. So within here, let is able to stop us from going through, similar to the question mark period in JavaScript. So it wouldn't actually go inside or do any of the information or any of the processing within inside that let. Okay, but however, if we were to set a value to flowering, we would be able to go inside and do whatever was inside of that let. Okay, and then the last way of adding a null safety within Kotlin that I'll share is the safe call operator. So it's a question mark with the colon. So in this example, we are either returning the value of flowering or false if the value of flowering is still null at this time. Whew, moving along here. So the last similarity that we'll look at is async await and coroutines. So within JavaScript, there's this thing called async await, which allows you to process asynchronous code. So in this example, we're doing a network call. So, sorry, gotta breathe. So Async is just a way to, just a way to process an asynchronous function. And then await is what actually allows you to get away from the use of callbacks. So it doesn't have to get continuously chained to get the value that you're actually seeking out of it. Within Kotlin, we have coroutines, and coroutines aren't new for Kotlin, but or only for Kotlin, but they are widely supported within Kotlin. So suspend tells us that this function will be asynchronous and that it at some point will be paused. In the function above it, function get plant from API. Global scope.launch is what actually creates the coroutine context for us and is able to do all of the processing for us and get that value for us when we need it. All right, so rounding it out, I'm going to share some of the reasons why I like Kotlin so far. So first, I like that it's in comparison to JavaScript, it's statically typed. Although you can add in TypeScript with JavaScript, I like that Kotlin, like right out of the box, is user-friendly and accessible and lets you know exactly what type you're using. Also, there is a function for everything. So you're able to chain within Kotlin to get to different values, but then also the IDEs help you to see what else is available on an object or a value. As well, it unleashes you to be able to develop for more than just mobile. So Kotlin can be used anywhere that Java can be used. So there's much more that you can do. So I guess hopefully over the course of this presentation, although it's rather fast, you're able to see that it's possible to, or that Kotlin is approachable even if you're not coming from a Java background. So there are similarities between JavaScript and Kotlin. So yeah, that is all. Are there any questions?
Okay, so I have a quick question. I know you said you learned JavaScript at the boot camp. How did you go about learning Kotlin? Did you take like an online course or read a book, or what did that learning process look like?
Yeah, so first I started out with a course on Udacity. I don't remember the name of it, but it's a Google course. And it started going through and just getting the basics down. At one point, it started to get really advanced. So then I took a step back. And also I've been learning with Sierra, who's on the call, pairing with her and going through and trying to drill in some of the, I guess, the fundamental concepts of structuring your code within Android. So it's a mixture of both online and then pairing with another person.
I have a question. What made you want to learn Kotlin? What was the choice you made there?
Let's see. So at first, it presented itself as a business need. So there was a team that was in need of an Android developer, and I was like, okay, I never thought of pursuing mobile, but I just decided to give it a try and just see if I could or move towards learning it. So instead of trying to learn a different framework, I approached the idea of learning a different language.
And I have to say, I talk to people about Kotlin and coroutines all the time, and you actually did a better job of explaining it than a lot of other people do. So thank you. Like that was really helpful. Thank you.
Okay.